The classes we've had for the past few of them have all been dealing with the era around the American Revolution. As why was there a revolution? Why the colonists won the revolution, and the development of the government after the revolution was over. Now we're going to fast forward. That is, now I want to go past the Revolutionary era and look at the generation that would have come of age about 1800, the times between about 1800 and 1840. This is a time of dramatic change in America. That is, you could argue that the people of the United States changed more in this 40-year period, experienced more change during this 40-year period than at any other comparable period of time in history. That's a big, huge, sweeping statement. And let's just look at something to compare it to. It is today 2020. 40 years ago was 1980. The world of 1980 was radically different than the one you live in. Right? Because think of the things you take for granted. How many of you have a cell phone? There were only a handful of cell phones in the entire country in 1980. The ones that were there were the size of a shoebox and were prohibitively expensive. You needed an antenna that was so big in order to send out a signal that it needed a car in order to carry it. They used to call them car phones until the 1990s. Almost everybody in this class is, well, everybody now in this class is probably listening to this class on a computer. Personal computer was only invented in 1978. There were only a handful of them in the country. You are using this class over internet. There was no internet in 1980. You had at that time a very rudimentary internet that was created in 1969. But the modern day World Wide Web that we take for granted today was only around in the 1990s. Most of you have been spending the last few weeks probably watching Netflix. The country barely had cable in 1980. Most of the country, your television was three channels: NBC, ABC, and CBS. Well, I lived out in rural Texas. There they only had one. Most of the people I went to school with only had access to one channel that broadcast TV. So, in things great and small, you look back 40 years ago, and the world around you really didn't exist yet. And you would not really recognize a lot of the things that most people did. But that's nothing compared to what the world changed between 1800 and 1840. Because although most of the things you take for granted didn't exist in 1980, you still would have been comfortable in the country. You would have understood the values of the country. You would have seen you would have understood how people looked at the world around them, how they dealt with each other, what they thought of as right and wrong, what they thought of as clean and unclean. That was not the case though in 1840. If you were in the America of 1800, if you stepped back in your time machine and went there, you, me, or anybody from the modern era would be totally lost. We would just not understand the country. It would be completely alien to us. Moses from the Bible would have felt a lot more comfortable in the America of 1800 than any of us would. However, if you fast forward 1840, we would understand the more advanced parts of the United States then. That if we were in a place like New York City or Philadelphia, the world around us would look poor, it would look dirty, but we would understand the basic mentality of it. Moses, however, would have been totally lost in the America of 1840. That's a pretty big jump from Moses to us in 40 years. So for the next few classes, we are going to be looking at this time period. That is, we're going to be looking at the things that were changing in the world around this time. And I want to start off by looking at the economy. That is, the economy of the United States, how people made a living radically shifted in the span of only 40 years, an adult person's working life. And there are two big changes I want to look at. One is that the United States economy is going to change from a subsistence economy to a market economy. And I'll define both of those in a minute. The other big change is the United States is going to shift from an agricultural society to an industrial one. So I want to spend the next couple of classes looking at that. Today's class, we're going to be looking at the shift to a market economy. And we're going to especially tie that to the developments in transportation. That is, the transportation system of America is going to shift, and that is going to be one of the large things leading to the development of a market economy. And then we'll look at the shift to an industrial economy, where transportation plays a large role, but so do a bunch of other large social changes that you're also seeing in the development of the market economy as well. So anyway, we're going to be looking at that. And I first want to start off with defining a term. The term is subsistence economy and market economy. We in the United States today live in a market economy. In a market economy, everyone in the country is a specialist. You specialize in doing something and you sell it for money. You then take the money and you use it to buy everything else you need to survive. I have the obscure specialty of the teaching of history. I sell that specialty in the Lone Star College for money, just not very much. I then take that money and I go to HEB for groceries. I, I go to the gas station for energy. I go and purchase an automobile for transportation, so on and so forth. That's a way of life we take for granted. That was not the way of life, though, most people in colonial America. If you were in, and times before, if you were in colonial America, early modern Europe, the Middle Ages, ancient Rome, a handful of people, the very wealthy, those who lived in the cities, lived in a market economy like we do today. The vast majority of the population, though, lived out in the countryside, and they lived according to a subsistence economy. In a subsistence economy, you go out and produce what you need to survive. You're not a specialist at all. Okay? You would live in a house like this. You would go out in your fields and you would produce food. You would grow fibers that your family would turn into cloth. First, you'd spin them into thread, then you'd take the thread and card it into cloth. You would then take that cloth and your family would make your own clothing with it. You would go off into the trees, chop them down, get firewood. You would make your own fuel. You would take some of the wood and you would make your furniture. You would take wood and use it as building materials. Right? So the things that we get from a Walmart, they would have to purchase themselves. And the typical person lived in a world that really didn't deal with money. That is, if you lived in this farm, right, you were somebody who produced who consumed what you produced. You did not have that much left over to sell. And you lived in a fairly isolated area. That was the difference between the land a middle class person owned and the land a rich person owned. Since you were isolated, even if you grew something extra, it would be very difficult to take it to a market and sell it. So if you lived in a house like this, you would probably spend most of your time growing a major staple crop, something like corn or wheat. You would eat most of it. You, however, would have a little bit left over that once you stored some in case there was like a drought that you would need extra food, you would take that stuff that you could sell and you turn it into whiskey. You would turn it into whiskey because that was the easiest thing to transport. You could then take it into a town, sell it for money, and with that money, you would pay for the things that you couldn't make yourself. That was a limited amount of stuff. Largely, that was dealing with iron products, stuff like horseshoes, nails, pins. Right? There was an expression in the past, some of y'all might still use it, of pin money. That's money that a married woman has just to take care of day-to-day eventualities, just lying around the house. That expression comes from in the old days. Women would save up money to buy pins for sewing. Think about that. I go out and I buy a shirt every now and then. It comes packed in with about 12 to 15 pins. What do I do with those pins? I throw them away. People of the past had to save up to buy something that I consider a nuisance. Right? So a subsistence person would live out in the countryside, would produce what they need to survive, would only make a handful of stuff that they could sell. That would be the only things they would be dealing with money. That money would go into buying the handful of things they couldn't make themselves, and go into taxes. So you lived a life that was very plain and austere. But you lived a life in colonial America that was actually pretty comfortable. That is, the typical American owned 50 to 200 acres, and on that they could produce more than enough food to survive off of. Right? So a typical American family was fairly well fed, so they would eat a fairly plain diet. Right? Your meal would involve corn, pork, and greens in some combination. And almost every day, you would be eating pretty much the same stuff. So you would have a life really without a whole lot of variety. Right? So you live in a past where most people in the world lived in a subsistence economy. Yeah, most people in the United States definitely lived in a subsistence economy. However, that is going to change over the course of the early 1800s. And what is going to change it is going to be this plant. It is called cotton. And let me give you some context for it. The English economy during the 1700s went through something called the Industrial Revolution. That is, a Scottish engineer named James Watt developed the rotary steam engine with planetary gears. That provided a great deal of power. That power was then put into factories. The English factories specialized in the manufacturing of cloth. Right? That was the major manufactured product of the 1700s. So those English factories were producing cloth. You need fibers to make cloth out of. In England, they had sheep, so they made woolen cloth. However, worldwide, there was only a limited demand for wool because wool is heavy, wool is itchy, and wool is hot. And the vast part of the world that is also hot, is where you have warm weather, they wanted a lightweight fabric, something that was light, something that was breathable, something that you could wear in warm weather. In all of Europe, the only thing they had to make lightweight cloth out of was linen. And linen then and now is prohibitively expensive. So the English factories that were producing cloth were looking for something to make lightweight cloth out of to fill this demand. And that's where cotton comes in, right? They had a cotton industry. Cotton was already a big crop throughout the world. There were four varieties of cotton plants. One came out of South America, one came out of Mexico, one came out of India, one came out of Africa. Right? Cotton accomplished what the world wanted, which was it was a fabric that was very light, and it was a fabric that you could wear in warm weather. So the British factories were looking for cotton that they could make cloth out of, right? And the that and with that, let's look into what cotton is. Cotton comes in a number of varieties. As I said, there were four basic strains of cotton around the world. The cotton the English factories could buy in the 1750s and 60s, as they're inventing the steam engine, is the stuff like what you see on the right here. This is called long staple cotton. Long staple cotton, the cotton fibers are long, right? And the advantage of this, why you could use it in an English factory, is since the fibers are long, it is pretty easy to clean. That is, if you look at the shorter plant here on the left, you see that the cotton plant in it has a bunch of seeds in it. That is, the fibers themselves are very rough and sticky, and the cotton seeds are like burrs, so they just get stuck in these fibers. The long staples, that is where you have long fibers in cotton, you could just take a comb and comb out the seeds and any impurities. So the cotton is easily ready to be put into a factory to turn into cloth, right? The problem with that is cotton with fibers this long only grows in a handful of areas. You have to have a tropical environment to do it. So it can grow in India. It can grow in Egypt. It can grow in a handful of areas off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Right? If you want to buy long staple cotton today, usually it's marketed in America under the heading Egyptian cotton. So if you have any Egyptian cotton robes, sheets, pillowcases, towels, that's what it is. It's long staple cotton. And if you have any of that stuff, you know that that's high grade stuff. It is very fluffy. It is soft. It is very absorbent. In America, Sea Island cotton is basically the same thing. It's a long staple cotton that's grown off the coast of South Carolina. But if you own any of that stuff, Sea Island cotton, Egyptian cotton, you also know that it's very expensive. They put them as registries for wedding gifts today, right? Because it can only be grown in a handful of places, it's in very short supply. The English factories, though, had an unlimited demand for cotton. So they needed a variety of cotton that could be grown in more places so they can have more of it, which is where this comes in. This is short staple cotton. Short staple cotton could be grown in subtropical areas. The main variety of it is the descendant of the variety that came out of Mexico. So if you went into, what is today the American South, you could grow this cotton in a lot of places in the interior of South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, eventually Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. But since the fibers are short and sticky, it is very difficult to get these seeds out of it. It was so difficult that as late as the 1780s, even if you used slaves, it wasn't economical to produce a lot of short staple cotton to export. And if you don't take the seeds out, you can't put it into a factory. Right? Historically, when they grew this type of cotton in Africa, India, among the Native Americans, you would grow it as a family. That is, a family would harvest a cotton plant. They just grow the cotton plants in with their food crops. The cotton doesn't go bad once you harvest it. So you could just stick it in a corner and wait for a slack time when you're growing food. Then you could hand pick the seeds out of the cotton and you could produce enough cotton to make a couple of set of clothes for the family. But if you want industrial grade cotton, enough cotton in order to fill up a factory, that's just too much labor. And even if you don't have to pay the labor, if you're using slaves, it's just too expensive. Right? So in the UK, there is an unlimited demand for short staple cotton. In America, there's an ability to grow short staple cotton, but you need to figure out a way to get these seeds out of it before you can really do anything past that. And that's where a man named Eli Whitney comes into the picture. Like, Eli Whitney was an engineer from Connecticut. They called him a mechanic. If you see him referred to that in a book, mechanic and what we refer to as an engineer were the same thing in the 1790s. That is, the engineer was just a generic term for anybody who worked with a machine. Right? Eli Whitney was from Connecticut, but he was hired by a woman named Catherine Green to work on her farm in South Carolina. Catherine Green was the widow of a Revolutionary War general named Nathaniel Green. Nathaniel Green was given a large plantation in South Carolina as a thank you gift for his service during the Revolution. He died and left the farm to his young, attractive widow, Catherine. Catherine hired Eli Whitney, the mechanic, to come by and operate the machinery on the farm. Apparently, she wanted more than that. She wanted a home entertainment system, if you know what I mean. But Eli Whitney didn't. Apparently, he was pretty dense. He had some of that Sheldon action going on. Anyway, Eli Whitney came to South Carolina. And in 1793, he claimed to invent this machine. He called it a cotton gin. In all probability, he didn't actually invent it, though. Some slave did. He just stole it. Right? However, he was able to patent it, and then nobody honored his patent. That is, once he wrote the patent out there, people just bootlegged the machine and didn't pay him. Karma's a bitch, you know. Right? Years later, he would also get a contract from the government to design interchangeable parts for guns. He didn't actually invent interchangeable parts. Somebody else did, but he took credit for it. So the history books give him credit for two inventions that he probably didn't actually make. Anyway, how the cotton gin works is you take your short staple cotton and you put it down the chute. You then turn this crank. The crank is attached to a cylinder that has needles on it. And the needles comb the cotton as it goes through the machine. So coming out this end will be cleaned cotton. The invention of the cotton gin is going to totally transform America. That is, all of America's history is going to be different as a result of it. Because there are going to be three long-term significances of the cotton gin. The first one was the impact that this machine is going to have on slavery. That is, when they wrote the Constitution in 1789, the United States had slaves. The United States existed because during the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and have inalienable rights granted by their creator. Right? So you can ask yourself, was it hypocritical that a nation that said that all men are created equal enslaves 20 to 25% of its population? You could say that that's just modern thinking and that at the time they wouldn't have considered that. But even as early as the revolution, they saw that that was hypocrisy. Right? The revolution led to the creation of anti-slavery societies in America. The first one was created by a man named Alexander Hamilton. And as the revolution comes to a close, you saw an escalating movement against slavery in America. In 1780, for example, a court in Massachusetts held that slavery violated something called the rights of man, and so was illegal in Massachusetts. That was the Elizabeth Freeman case. I think I gave you Freeman as one of the terms to look up in the book. She was a slave in Massachusetts. She sued for her freedom. She won. The following year, the state of North Carolina, New Hampshire, rewrote their constitution, and the New Hampshire Constitution made slavery illegal in the state. So what followed was a succession of states rewrote their constitutions to make slavery illegal. So slavery was actually one of the big debates when they were writing the Constitution. The Constitution decided in favor of keeping slavery. There was indirect references to slavery in the Constitution, about 3 or 4 of them. They all favored the slave owners. That is, they said that the slaves would count in the census when you were apportioning representatives in Congress, which gave slave owners more representation in Congress. They guaranteed the existence of the slave trade for at least 20 more years after the writing of the Constitution, which was actually a reverse from the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation made it illegal to import slaves. The U.S. Constitution guaranteed that if a slave escaped and went into a jurisdiction where slavery was illegal, that jurisdiction would have to send the escaped slave back, right, to his owner. Right? So if you're a slave in Maryland, you escape into Pennsylvania where slavery was illegal. Pennsylvania was legally bound by the Constitution to send you back to Maryland. Right? And the Constitution guarantees that the government will put down a slave revolt in Article 4, Section 4. So the Constitution was a document designed to protect slavery, but the writers of the Constitution were embarrassed about it. If you read the Constitution, they don't actually use the word slave until the 13th Amendment ends slavery. Right? They were referring to slaves through euphemisms, like other persons, that if you didn't know what you were looking for, you probably couldn't find. Right? The rationalization the writers of the Constitution gave for this is the states that have slavery need the money. They don't want to give up slavery, and we want to keep the country going. And we can make this concession to allow slavery to continue because slavery is an anachronism. It's a product for the past. It's still around, but if we leave it alone, it'll go away on its own. That was the thinking of the writers of the Constitution in 1791. It is questionable whether that was ever true. But if it was ever true, the cotton gin killed it. Because once you have the cotton gin, cotton becomes the most profitable product made in America. By the time you get to the 1800s, buying slaves, buying land, and growing cotton will get you an 8% return on investment per year. That's comparable to today's stock market. This was the best investment in the country. So If you can make that kind of money owning slaves to grow cotton, then you're going to own slaves. So the movement against slavery, as a result, basically stopped in America, and slavery would be reinforced by the cotton industry, right? And that's going to have all kinds of impacts for the future of the United States right up until the end of this third class for 1301. So the cotton gin is going to reinforce slavery. Second big impact of the cotton gin is it is going to lead to the expansion of the United States. That is, the growers of cotton in America were people who were going to exclusively grow cotton. They were going to specialize in it. Cotton is very hard on soil. So if all you do is grow cotton, you're going to kill off the soil pretty quickly. In a world before you have fertilizers, this means you need new lands for cotton constantly, right? So if you look at the maps of the United States in the 1800s, America keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. One of the things that's going to drive this is cotton. That is, cotton farmers are going to be constantly looking for new cotton lands. For example, cotton can be grown in Alabama and Mississippi. This turns out to be the best cotton growing areas in the country by the Civil War. In 1790, those areas were controlled by Native Americans. And so, in order to get those lands for cottons, those Native Americans were expelled. If you're familiar with the Trail of Tears, that's why you had the Trail of Tears, so that cotton producers could go in and take that land. The desire to grow cotton led the United States to buy Louisiana. Okay? Their desire to grow cotton leads the United States to annex Texas. So cotton is going to lead to the strengthening of slavery. Cotton is going to lead to the expansion of the physical expansion of the country. But what we're going to concentrate on in the class today is cotton is going to be one of the driving forces in creating a market economy in America, right? And let's look at why. Say you own a cotton plantation. You got yourselves 50 slaves, you have land, you put your 50 slaves into the land, they grow you cotton. Those 50 slaves have to eat. They're going to need housing. They're going to need clothes. Right? They're going to need tools in order to go out in the fields and work with. You are a rich guy. So what you want yourself a big mansion. You want yourself a nice furniture. You want yourself some fancy clothes. You want a wine collection. So how do you get all that stuff? Well, if you were in France in 1400, you would take your forced laborers, your peasants, and tell them to make it. You would tell your slaves to go out and chop trees, bring the lumber back, build their own houses. You would tell the slaves to make their own cloth, to make their own clothes. You would tell the slaves to go in and make farm tools. You would tell the slaves to build your mansion. You tell the slaves to make you furniture. You tell the slaves to stomp on your wine grapes. But in 1800, if you tell slaves to do that, your forced laborers to do that, then your slaves aren't growing cotton. And remember, cotton is the most valuable commodity in the world. You can get an 8% return on investment by growing cotton. Right? Every minute a slave spends chopping trees is a minute the slave isn't growing cotton. Every minute a slave makes making clothes is a minute that the slave isn't growing cotton. Every minute that a slave is stomping wine grapes is a minute that the slave isn't growing cotton. Which means, as a slave owner, those are minutes that'll cost you money. But you still need all that stuff. So how are you going to get it? Well, you're going to tell your slaves to exclusively grow cotton. And once they grow cotton, you're going to sell it for money. You are then going to take the money and buy everything else you need. That is, you'll buy tools with money. You'll buy wine with money. Right? You'll buy clothing for your slaves with money. Right? That is, you are going to be a specialist, a seller of one product and a buyer of everything else. That is a market economy. Right? And now that you have something so valuable, it being the center of a market economy, this huge amount of money that's coming out of cotton production, You can now bring everywhere else into in America into this market economy too, because after all, these slave plantations eat everything. They need corn, they need cloth, right? They need whiskey, they need uh, peppers. If you can make it, these slave plantations are going to buy it, and they have money to pay for it. So all over America, people saw the slave plantations as a huge buyer. And a lot of people in America wanted to sell to them. Among the people who did would have been the small farmers of America. That is, if you lived on this farm, you did grow some extra corn or wheat, okay, that you wouldn't consume yourself and you didn't need to save. Traditionally, as I said, you would turn that into whiskey, sell it in the town, and use that to buy the things that you couldn't make yourself. These cotton plantations can pay a lot more than, okay, some town can pay for whiskey. So if you could get your corn, your wheat to the cotton plantations, you could make a lot of money. So the small farmers of America went to their governments at the local, state, national America and told them this. They wanted a way to get to the slave plantations, which means they needed a much better system of transportation than existed in colonial America. In colonial times, they really didn't build roads. That is, the road system in America was something they inherited from the Indians. The Indians over the years had walked through the forests and cleared out paths. That was basically it. So if you lived in the interior, it was prohibitively expensive for you and prohibitively slow to bring in anything like corn or wheat and transport over long distances. So you want your governments to build you a transportation system that'll let you do this. Ordinarily, a government would say no. But if you are a small farmer in the 1790s, you believe the country you live in is justified by five words: all men are created equal. But remember when we talked about the Constitution in the last class? The Constitution isn't actually designed to work that way. The Constitution was written by rich people who held the power within the government. They drew up a system that would keep power for themselves, keep a government they could control. But how they were able to get middle class people to go along with this was by giving them the symbolic concession that the country is theirs, that all men are really equal. So when the majority of people start demanding a better transportation system to get to the cotton plantations, the wealthy guys who run the governments are going to have a very hard time saying no. So you start to see government at state, local, and national levels all start to put money into building transportation to allow the small farmers to get crops to these big slave plantations to fill this market, right? And let me show you some of the stuff that they would wind up building. The first step in transportation was to try to create a system of roads in America. These roads were called turnpikes. I believe I put that term on your list. This is what a turnpike would look like. That is, how you would build this road is you'd go to the forest along a path. You would chop down trees and you would lay them side to side on the path like rollers. You would then shovel dirt between the logs to hold them in place. They called them turnpikes because in Old English in the 16 and 1700s, a pike was a synonym for a log. So if you rolled a wagon down this road, your wagon wheels would turn the pikes. Right? They also call them corduroy roads, right? Kind of like the fabric, if any of you have ever had any corduroy clothes. The road wasn't named after the fabric was named after the road. That is, corduroy is a corruption of the French term cour de bois, which is road of the king. Right? As you can see, these roads have this kind of ridged pattern where it goes high-low. So when they started producing cloth that looked like that, they called it corduroy. Anyway, these roads were very limited. It is the width of this road was one wagon wide. So if you have a wagon coming from this direction and a wagon going this direction, one of those wagons is going to have to get off the road to let the other one pass. You had a different type of road rage around 1790 or so. Okay? These roads were very vulnerable to weather. That is, the road is made out of wood and dirt. So if it rained, the whole road could wash away, and at best it would turn into a bunch of muck. These roads are very uncomfortable. That is, as you roll down on a wagon down this road, you're bouncing a lot of things you really don't want to bounce in, if you know what I mean. But the number one problem with this road was going to be expensive. I don't mean expensive to build. I mean it's going to be expensive to ride a wagon on it. I'll explain why. Any wagon is going to be pulled by horses. You think that would mean that what would follow would be cheap, because after all, the horses could just go over, eat the grass, and keep on going. But any of you who owns a horse know this isn't true. If horses don't eat the right stuff, they get colic and die. Right? So if you were going to have horses, you would have to bring fodder along for those horses to eat. And that turns out to be really expensive, even before you get to the vet bills. And let me give you something to compare it to. If you look into your bills, you probably find, well, not now because nobody can drive anywhere. You probably find under normal circumstances, you spend a lot of money on gasoline. Gasoline is a bill that you notice. Right? Gasoline before the coronavirus hit was selling for $2 a gallon. Now I think it's about $1.50. But 10 years ago, it was up around $4. When it was $4, it was a real headache for a lot of people. But even at $2, it's a bill that a lot of people would rather not pay. A gallon of gasoline that you can buy for $2, though, has the equivalent amount of energy as 25,000 calories worth of food. What that means is if you could eat gasoline, you would get enough energy out of it in order to keep an adult man going for 10 days. And, and it only costs $2. For those of you who buy your own groceries, think how much you spend per person on groceries. Right? An adult man will spend $50 on groceries easy. Right? If you really shop, maybe you could get that down to about 25. If you could eat gasoline, it would be down to 2. Right? That's why once you invent diesel fuel and the gasoline, you really radically change land transportation. You make it much, much cheaper. So these turnpikes, although they were better than what they had in the past, still are not good enough to take a bulk product like corn or wheat to the slave plantations. In order to do that, to be able to justify the cost, you have to use water. Water was historically the way that you move stuff across long distances because water transportation was always cheap. Right? However, if you were a small farmer, you lived in relatively isolated areas. Right? So you didn't have ready access to the ocean, the cheapest way to move stuff. So what you saw were governments starting to put money into getting ways for you to be able to access water transportation. The first step in this is the creation of something called the steamboat. The steamboat was invented by a man named Robert Fulton in America. He took one of those steam engines that in Britain were used in order to power factories, and he put it on a boat and used the piston from the steam engine to operate a water wheel. The steamboat he built, the Clermont, could travel up and down the Hudson River at the blinding speed of 4 miles an hour. 4 miles an hour does not sound that impressive. The Army says one of its soldiers with a full pack can walk 4 miles an hour. So if you're in good shape, yeah, and the Clermont went from New York to Albany, if you ran along the bank, you would beat the Clermont to Albany. But the key word in there was full pack. A full pack for a man would be about 100 to 200 pounds. The Claremont could carry goods by the ton and still make 4 miles an hour. Right? And 4 miles an hour is enough to take a ton of grain all the way across the country before it rots. Right? So it was fast enough. A steamboat also has the advantage of being independent of the weather. That is, historically, if you used water, you would either power your boat by a sail or by oars, or you would be carried along by the current. If the wind isn't blowing, you can't use a sail. Right? If the current is too strong, you can't row against it. Right? So if you've got a steam engine, though, you've got enough power that you're independent of the weather. The weather could be whatever it wants, you can travel. Let me give you an illustration of that. Say you're a farmer in Cincinnati. You grew grain and you wanted to take it down in New Orleans to sell it to the slave plantations. You could put your ton of grain on a raft. You would then float the raft down the Ohio River. Okay? The Ohio River would eventually meet up with the Mississippi. You would then float your raft down the Mississippi River. You would eventually get to New Orleans, where you would sell your grain. You now have to get back to Cincinnati. How you would do that is you would take your raft, take it down to the local lumber dealer, chop it up into kindling, and sell it. You would then take the money you got from the raft and put it in your pocket next to the money you got for your grain. You would then walk to Ohio. Right? People used to walk a lot more than they do today. Because although you could take a boat down the current to New Orleans, you couldn't fight against the current to get back into the interior. This boat can. So the steamboat is going to be revolutionary. However, the steamboat can only operate where you've got rivers or navigable lakes. Right? That's only a handful of areas in the country. And most people, remember, the smaller farmers live in the interior. So what they need in order to really take advantage of this is somebody to bring the river to them. They want the government to build them a river. And in the first half of the 1800s, the governments of America did just that. Okay, the starting point in this was the state of New York. Right? In 1810, the state of New York had a governor named DeWitt Clinton. And DeWitt Clinton had an idea. The idea was to dig a ditch between Albany and Buffalo, basically to make an artificial river. He wanted to do this because Buffalo was on the Great Lakes. It's on Lake Erie. The Great Lakes are a series of lakes that stretch for a couple of thousand miles into the interior of America. So it's a natural superhighway. Albany is on the Hudson River, which is navigable by ocean-going ships. So if you have an artificial river that runs from here to here, right, then if anybody makes anything over here along the Great Lakes and they want to sell it anywhere else in the world, it would have to go through New York first. If anybody makes something in the rest of the world and they wanted to bring it in the interior of America, they would have to bring it in through New York first. That would make New York a very strategic location. That would make big shots in New York make a lot of money. So Clinton proposed this to the legislature, that they go in and build an artificial river here. The legislature thought he was nuts. Okay? Because let's talk about what he wants to do here. The distance between Albany and Buffalo is 364 miles. The UK was the most technologically advanced nation of the world at this time. They were having a boom in building canals. The longest canal in all of England was 20 miles. DeWitt Clinton wants to build a 364-mile canal. And he wants to build it in a nation that doesn't really have a whole lot of technical expertise. In all of America, there was one college of engineering in 1810. That was the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So he has to build a long, technically complicated project without really a whole lot of engineering expertise. If you look at this area, they want to dig 364 miles and then dig through these mountains over here to get to Albany. And they want to do all of this time at a time before they've invented steam shovels or dynamite. How does Clinton plan on digging that ditch? Well, he's going to hire 30,000 Irishmen and give them 25 cents a day and a shovel. Hey, in addition to that, the water levels at Lake Erie and the Hudson River are different. So all you do is dig a ditch, the water will flow from the high end to the low end. You'll never be able to keep the canal going. So in order to make that work, you have to build a series of water escalators called locks. Locks were the most technologically complicated thing to build in the early 1800s. And the Erie Canal would require 10 of them. Remember, in a country where they only got one college of engineering. And the whole project would be prohibitively expensive. It would cost the state of New York $7 million to build this. $7 million doesn't sound like a lot, but as a percentage of the gross national product of the United States in 1817, it would be the equivalent today of 196 billion. And that entire bill would be borne by one state, New York. This was impossibly grandiose. And so the legislature didn't want to build it. They wind up building it anyway. Why are they going to build it? Because all over this part of New York by 1817, you're going to have small farmers. These small farmers are going to want this artificial river to take their extra crops to market, right? And since all men are created equal, they had enough juice in the legislature to force the legislature to act, even though they didn't particularly want to. So the state of New York wound up building an artificial river. They called it the Erie Canal. Right? A canal is just a word for an artificial river. It stretched from Albany to Buffalo on Lake Erie. Eventually, they would wind up digging north-south canals to feed into the bigger Erie Canal, which ran east to west. The Erie Canal also tied into these lakes over here, which run north-south. They were called the Finger Lakes, right? So you basically had a transportation network that went throughout the state of New York. They built it between 1817 and 1825. It opened for business in 1825. This is what it looked like in operation. The canal itself was only about 6 feet deep, right? So you couldn't put something like a steamboat into it. So what you would do instead was you would bring cargo on that canal in flat bottom barges like this one. They would also build roads on the sides of the canal. So if you had the money, you could hook up your barge to horses or oxen on the side of the road that would pull your barge. If you didn't have that kind of money, then you would pay a guy to stand on top of your raft with a 10-foot pole and push it through your canal. Right? This was a grandiose project, and it was spectacularly successful. Right? The Erie Canal totally revolutionized the United States. Right? And let's look into why. Say you were a small farmer, you lived right over here. This is Seneca Falls, New York. I used to live there when I was about 7 or 8. I lived on Canal Street, by the way. Actually, I lived on Adam Drive, which was right down the road from Canal Street. If you were a small farmer over here in 1824, before they built the canal, you would have a little bit of leftover grain after you brought in your harvest. You would turn into whiskey, and you would take the whiskey down to Albany and sell it. You'd then walk home with the money. But in 1825, as you're getting ready to plant your crop, an agent from a slave plantation owner in Augusta, Georgia, comes to you. And he tells you this year, don't turn your leftover corn into whiskey. Sell it to me instead. I'll give you twice as much money for it as you would have got selling it, turned it into whiskey. Why? How could he do that? Because he has made the calculation that if he took your grain, whatever it is, wheat or corn, he puts it on a barge, floats the barge down to Albany, loads your grain onto an ocean going ship, and then takes the ocean going ship from Albany and takes it down to Augusta, Georgia, that would cost him less money than bringing in a ton of grain from 150 miles in the interior of Georgia. That's how cheap this canal made transportation. So that even if you're growing something big and heavy that doesn't sell for a whole lot, like wheat, you can now transport it and sell it. Right? So you're the small farmer over here. You sell your leftover grain to the slave plantation owner's agent. You now have more money than you ever thought about having before. So what would you do next year? Well, if you're ambitious, maybe you get the idea that I could make more grain to sell this guy. Right? But you, right? That makes sense. But remember, you have to produce enough stuff to survive. So if you spend more of your limited amount of time growing extra grain to sell, then you're not producing lumber for your home. Then you're not growing vegetables. Then you're not raising livestock. Then you're not building buildings. Right? Then you're not dealing with all the stuff that you need to survive on your farm. So then how can you come up with the labor to grow that extra grain to sell? Right? Well, you could hire it, but once again, with that, you would need money. So what could you do? Well, how about doing the same thing the slave owner did? That is, you could become a specialist. You could spend all of your time growing grain. Right? You could then sell that grain for money. You could then use that money in order to buy everything else you need to survive. Right? That is, you could use it in order to hire laborers. You could use it in order to buy clothes. You could use it in order to buy vegetables. You could use it in order to hire somebody to build your house. You could use it to buy building materials. That is, you could live like us. How could all that stuff get to you? Well, it could come to you through the same to the same canal that takes your crop out. Right? So the next thing you know, by the 1830s, this entire part of New York is full of market-oriented farmers. They become specialists who grow food to sell to the slave owners and buy everything else with money. This becomes some of the most valuable real estate in America as a result, right? And this became a place where a lot of go-getters went. That is, upstate New York over here along the Erie Canal was the equivalent of the 1830s of what, say, San Francisco or Silicon Valley is today. This is where a bunch of young guys who are looking for deals, who want to become entrepreneurs, where they would pack up and move. And much like San Francisco today, this wound up with a bunch of weirdos up there. That is, if you ever go to San Francisco, there are a bunch of new fads that always come there first, religious cults, that kind of thing. You saw the same thing in upstate New York. That is, you saw the development of a lot of new ideas. They used to call it the burnt over district because religious revivals hit there so often. Most of that is gone today, but however, there is one long term impact of that that is still around, and that is the Church of Latter day Saints. Joseph Smith developed it here in upstate New York. That is, he was caught up in that whole kind of environment that you saw in the New York of the 1830s. He was eventually driven out of New York, but his church is still around. Anyway, so New York was spectacularly successful by building the Erie Canal. Since it was so successful, it had a bunch of imitators. So other states started to build their own canal systems. Right? And the next thing you know, if you had two bodies of water, they were connected by a canal in most of the United States. The exception was the southern states, right? Because as these cotton plantations became more and more successful. The owners of those plantations, the wealthy people of the South, became richer and richer. So they had power in their states that would be very similar to what you would see in Europe, where the handful of aristocrats dominated their governments. So if you weren't rich, you didn't have much of a voice in the state governments. You could vote all you wanted, but these guys had so much power that unless they gave their go ahead, they did nothing would be done. And if you were rich, you already owned land that was accessible to transportation, so you weren't going to build it for other people. In, however, the areas where slaves weren't, the rich weren't that rich in comparison to everyone else. So middle class people who said that all men are created equal had a lot more influence in their state governments. So states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Massachusetts, they all start building canal networks. These canal networks revolutionized their states, but they were still limited. What limited them were the problems of the canals themselves. And let's take a look at what kind of problems you'd have with a canal. You have in a canal shallow water. These canals are only about 6 feet deep. If you've ever been to this part of the country, in the wintertime, it is not just cold, it is ass cold. Right? The first snow of the year falls on Halloween. Okay, if you're in Seneca Falls, New York, you have a solid blanket of a foot of it on the ground by Thanksgiving, and that blanket isn't going anywhere until March. So that's the case. What's going to happen to 6 feet of water in the wintertime? Yeah, so these canals are going to be very vulnerable to the weather. When it gets cold, they're going to freeze over. They also made these canals difficult to maintain because once water freezes, it expands. Once it thaws, it shrinks. So that's going to be constantly wearing at the canal. So you're going to have to be constantly rebuilding it. This is especially going to be true at the locks. Locks are inherently difficult to maintain. And especially if they freeze and thaw, that machinery is going to get very warped. So the canals are vulnerable to the weather. They were expensive to maintain. And if you wanted a canal, you had to have two bodies of water that could be hooked up. So large sections in the interior of the country just didn't work with them. They weren't near enough to a body of water to hook them up to a canal. So ideally, what you would have is you would have a way to connect places without requiring water at all. That would make it easier to maintain, it would make it less vulnerable to the weather, and you could build them anywhere. Which leads to this. In the first decade of the 1800s, British engineers started to experiment with using a steam engine on a vehicle that could operate on land. They called it a locomotive. These vehicles were so heavy that there was no road in Britain that could hold them up. That is, you put them on a dirt road, they would just sink straight into it. So what they did in order to solve that problem was they would lay iron rails on the ground, and then they would run the locomotive over there. In doing so, they created the railroad. The first railroad is built in the United States in 1828. And you see a boom in railroad construction starting about 1840. And this is the American Rail Network by 1851, right? The railroad solves the problems of the canal. That is, it gives you all the advantages of the canal in that uh, it can transport goods over long distances cheaply and bulky goods at that, but they're a lot cheaper to maintain and you don't need water. They're not as vulnerable to the weather. And if you look at the railroad map over here, you can see that although you see railroads everywhere, the bulk of the American rail network by 1851 is in the states where the slaves are not. That is, slavery ends about here, with Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, and Missouri. You see a lot more railroads over here, right? Why railroads over here? Because although the American railroads are going to be privately owned, by the way, so were most of the canals and even a lot of the turnpikes, they were going to get funded by state governments. And remember, in the slave states, the states' governments were dominated by the slave owners. So if the railroad didn't benefit them, they weren't going to let state money be spent on them. And if you're a big slave owner, you already own land that is accessible to the ocean. You don't need better transportation. It's the smaller farmers who need it. Over here, where you don't have big slave owners dominating the state governments, you have a national consensus behind building transportation. Right? You have all men are created equal, which is leading them to listen to the small farmers because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. So, what that means is by the time you get to 1860, if you're in an area that doesn't have slavery, you are now connected to a national transportation network that can get your stuff all over the country, meaning that what happened with the Erie Canal is happening to you all over America. You're seeing small farmers, the majority of the country, rather than being subsistence anymore. That is, just producing what they need to survive. They're becoming specialists. They're producing stuff to sell, and they're taking the money they get from what they grew to buy everything else they need to survive. Right? They have changed from the world of Moses to the world of us. Right? And you can see a lot of things that were coming into that. You can see kind of the political culture change to ones where all men are created equal, which gives small farmers a lot of influence to get what they want. If they don't have that, then you don't move anywhere. But by having that, you can step forward. You also see okay, the impact of government here, where governments are willing to get involved because all men are created equal. They can provide the capital in order to build a transportation system. And you see the transportation system itself that makes it now economical to move stuff across long distances to be a market oriented person. So by the time you get into 1840, the United States is becoming increasingly market oriented. And this is true of common people as well as rich people. So the next step for America is to become an industrial nation. And we'll go over how that happens in the next recording that I will do shortly.